At the dawn of the 20th century, the Baltic lands of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia found themselves situated at a precarious intersection of empires. For centuries, their territories had been contested between German, Swedish, Polish, Lithuanian, and Russian rulers. By the end of the First World War, the collapse of the Russian and German empires created a rare opening. Between 1918 and 1920, each Baltic nation declared independence, fought wars against both Bolshevik and German forces, and secured fragile sovereignty. These republics emerged with parliamentary constitutions, small but professional armies, and economies centered on agriculture and timber exports. Yet the geopolitical environment surrounding them remained uncertain. To the east stood the Soviet Union, which viewed the independence of the Baltic states as a temporary anomaly. To the west, Germany harbored its own interest in the region, driven by trade and long-standing cultural influence. The interwar years gave the Baltic republics little room for maneuver. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania all pursued policies of neutrality, hoping to preserve independence by avoiding entanglement in broader European disputes. Nonetheless, by the 1930s, their economies were drawn increasingly into Germany's orbit. Berlin became the main purchaser of Baltic agricultural products, while German capital influenced shipping and trade networks. At the same time, the Soviet Union strengthened its military presence near the western frontier, building bases and fortifications as part of its broader defense strategy. This delicate balance meant that both Berlin and Moscow kept the Baltic states within their spheres of interest, even as London and Paris offered little tangible security. The rise of authoritarian regimes in the Baltic mirrored broader European trends. In Lithuania, Antanas Smetona seized power in a 1926 coup, installing a regime that curtailed political freedoms. In Latvia and Estonia, political instability during the early 1930s led to similar shifts. Karlis Ulmanis in Latvia and Konstantin Pats in Estonia dissolved parliaments, restricted parties, and emphasized national unity. These changes reflected a search for stability, but they also left the republics isolated, lacking strong alliances or democratic partners. By the eve of the Second World War, the Baltic leaders faced an increasingly hostile environment with limited capacity to defend sovereignty. The strategic calculations of great powers sealed the region's fate. On 23 August 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, accompanied by secret protocols that divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. According to these terms, Estonia, Latvia, and later Lithuania were placed under Soviet control. For the Baltic governments, the pact was not public knowledge, yet its consequences became apparent almost immediately. Germany invaded Poland on 1 September 1939, and the Soviet Union entered from the east on 17 September. Within weeks, Poland ceased to exist, and the Baltic states faced mounting Soviet pressure. By October 1939, the Soviet Union demanded mutual assistance treaties with Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Under these agreements, Moscow secured the right to station tens of thousands of Red Army troops on Baltic soil and to establish naval and air bases. Estonia accepted on the 28th September, Latvia on 5 October, and Lithuania on 10 October, though Lithuania was compensated with Vilnius, and part of the Vilnius region seized from Poland. These arrangements preserved formal independence, but they eroded sovereignty. Soviet forces quickly occupied key positions, and local governments could no longer act without accounting for Moscow's presence. Public sentiment across the Baltic reflected anxiety and resignation. Many citizens feared the return of Russian domination, recalling the experiences of Tsarist rule, while others believed compliance might spare their nations from total annexation. At the same time, some segments of society hoped that Germany, now at war with Britain and France, might act as a counterbalance. The Wehrmacht's rapid victories in 1939 and 1940 heightened both fascination and apprehension in Riga, Tallinn, and Kaunas. Yet, with Western Europe consumed by its own crises, the Baltic republics remained vulnerable outposts, exposed to the ambitions of their two powerful neighbors. In June 1940, as France collapsed before the German blitzkrieg, the Soviet Union moved decisively. Accusing the Baltic states of violating the mutual assistance treaties, Moscow issued ultimatums demanding the formation of pro-Soviet governments and the admission of additional Red Army units. Isolated diplomatically and unable to resist militarily, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania accepted. Within days, Soviet forces occupied the capitals, disarmed national armies, and installed new administrations. By August 1940, each republic was formally incorporated into the Soviet Union as a constituent republic. The annexation marked the end of interwar independence and the beginning of a new contested era. For Stalin, the Baltic shorelines provided strategic depth against Germany, with naval bases controlling access to the Gulf of Finland and airfields extending Soviet reach toward Scandinavia. For Berlin, the Soviet move signaled both a threat and a bargaining chip, since the German economy relied heavily on Baltic trade. For ordinary Latvians, Lithuanians, and Estonians, the incorporation meant sudden political transformation. National symbols were abolished, parties dissolved, and collectivization policies introduced. Thus, by the summer of 1940, the geopolitical chessboard had shifted dramatically. The Baltic states were no longer independent actors, but territories absorbed into the Soviet system, yet their populations remained wary of Moscow's grip. As Germany prepared its next moves in Europe, the fate of the Baltics remained bound to the clash between Hitler and Stalin, setting the stage for an even more destructive confrontation. The Soviet incorporation of the Baltic republics in 1940 has brought about rapid structural changes, transforming political, social, and economic life. In Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, Soviet authorities dismantled existing institutions and replaced them with organizations modeled on Moscow's system. Parliaments were dissolved, and new people's assemblies were elected under the supervision of communist cadres, with only pro-Soviet candidates permitted. These assemblies then formally petitioned for entry into the Soviet Union, a process completed by August. The transition was orchestrated as a legal procedure, but in practice it was the outcome of overwhelming Soviet military presence and centralized directives from Moscow. The national armies of the Baltic states were absorbed into the Red Army as territorial corps, the 22nd Territorial Rifle Corps in Estonia, the 24th in Latvia, and the 29th in Lithuania. Though these formations were initially composed of local soldiers and officers, Soviet authorities soon purged large portions of the officer corps, viewing them as politically unreliable. Thousands of officers and soldiers were dismissed, arrested, or deported to camps in the Soviet interior. The Red Army garrisons expanded, while Baltic units were increasingly integrated under Soviet command structures. For local populations, this marked the end of national defense institutions that had symbolized sovereignty since independence. Economic reorganization followed swiftly. Banks, large enterprises, and foreign-owned businesses were nationalized. Land reform decrees redistributed property, breaking up larger estates and promising plots to landless peasants, though in practice the measures prepared the ground for future collectivization. Trade with Germany, which had dominated Baltic markets, was sharply curtailed. Instead, economic ties were redirected toward the Soviet Union, often at disadvantageous terms for local producers. The sudden shift disrupted established patterns of commerce, causing shortages of consumer goods while funneling raw materials into Soviet supply chains. Cultural and political institutions were reshaped to align with Soviet ideology. Newspapers, radio stations, and schools were brought under strict censorship. Symbols of independence, flags, coats of arms, national anthems were banned, replaced with Soviet emblems. Communist Party branches expanded rapidly, though membership often grew out of necessity rather than ideological conviction. Religious institutions faced new restrictions. Churches lost property, and clergy were subjected to surveillance. Intellectuals and academics, previously oriented toward Western Europe, encountered pressure to conform to Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy. Repression intensified in 1941. The Soviet Security Services, NKVD, conducted mass arrests targeting political leaders, military officers, businessmen, clergy, and anyone labeled as hostile to Soviet power. On the night of 13 to 14 June 1941, just days before the German invasion of the Soviet Union, a large-scale deportation operation was carried out. Approximately 15,000 people from Lithuania, 1,000 from Latvia, and 6,000 from Estonia were forcibly taken from their homes and transported in cattle cars to remote regions of Siberia and Kazakhstan. Many of the deportees were women and children, separated from male family members who were often sent to gulag camps. The deportations left a lasting mark on Baltic societies, with entire families uprooted in a single night. Amid these changes, public sentiment diverged. Some individuals joined new Soviet institutions, seeing opportunities for advancement or believing that integration with the Soviet Union offered security in a world dominated by great powers. Others quietly resisted, maintaining underground networks or seeking ways to preserve national identity under occupation. For many, survival required adapting outwardly to the new order, while privately holding on to traditions and loyalties. Internationally, the annexation of the Baltic states was not recognized by Western powers such as the United States and the United Kingdom, which continued to view Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia as occupied territories. Yet, the geopolitical situation in 1940-41 limited any practical action. Britain was engaged in its struggle against Germany, and the United States had not yet entered the war. The Baltic question remained unresolved on the diplomatic stage, while in practice the region was firmly under Soviet control. This Soviet presence, however, was soon to face a dramatic reversal. On 22 June 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The Wehrmacht's rapid advance into the Baltic region dismantled Soviet authority within weeks. The Red Army, unprepared for the scale and speed of the German offensive, retreated eastward in disarray. In Riga, Tallinn, and Kaunas, German troops were greeted not only as conquerors, but, in some quarters, as liberators from Soviet rule. The shifting front line reopened the Baltic lands to another occupying power, and once again, Latvians, Lithuanians, and Estonians would be forced to navigate survival between two empires at war. The German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 transformed the Baltic region almost overnight. Within days of Operation Barbarossa, Wehrmacht armored divisions, supported by Luftwaffe airstrikes, advanced deep into Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. The Soviet 8th and 11th Armies, tasked with defending the Baltic front, were overwhelmed. Many Soviet units were encircled in large pockets around Kaunas, Daugavpils, and along the Daugava River. By early July, German Army Group North had secured Riga and much of Latvia, while Panzer Group 4 pressed toward Estonia and the approaches to Leningrad. Soviet defensive lines collapsed quickly, with tens of thousands of soldiers captured. The retreat of Soviet forces created a power vacuum that allowed local uprisings to emerge. In Lithuania, the so-called June Uprising broke out as underground resistance groups sought to restore independence in the brief interval between Soviet retreat and German arrival. Provisional committees declared the re-establishment of a Lithuanian state, though German occupation authorities quickly dismantled these efforts. In Latvia and Estonia, similar though smaller-scale revolts took place, driven by resentment of Soviet repression and mass deportations just weeks earlier. Armed groups attacked retreating Soviet forces, liberated towns, and attempted to reorganize local administration. Yet these movements were short-lived, as German authorities asserted control and incorporated the region into their occupation system. By the end of summer 1941, the Baltic states were integrated into the Reichskommissariat Ostland, with Riga as its administrative center. Alfred Rosenberg, Reich Minister for the occupied Eastern Territories, oversaw policy, while local administration was delegated to German officials supported by Baltic auxiliaries. National independence was not restored. Instead, the territory was treated as a colonial possession. German authorities aimed to exploit agricultural production, timber, and labor resources for the war effort. At the same time, harsh racial and political policies were implemented, targeting Jews, communists, and anyone associated with Soviet power. For many Balts, the arrival of German forces initially seemed to promise relief from Soviet rule. The memory of deportations in June 1941 made segments of the population view the Wehrmacht as liberators. However, expectations of restored sovereignty quickly faded. The German occupation introduced its own system of coercion. Baltic men were drafted into auxiliary police units, security battalions, and later Waffen-SS divisions. These formations played roles in anti-partisan warfare and in the Holocaust, which unfolded rapidly across the region. Between 1941 and 1944, nearly the entire pre-war Jewish population of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, about 2,000 people, was murdered in mass shootings, ghettos, and camps, often with local collaboration under German supervision. The occupation also reshaped daily life. Agricultural quotas forced farmers to deliver large portions of harvests to German authorities. Cities experienced shortages of food and fuel, while the black market expanded. Industrial production was redirected toward the German war economy. Forced labor regulations sent thousands of Baltic civilians to work in Germany, often under harsh conditions. Resistance simmered beneath the surface, though open opposition was dangerous. Small partisan groups operated in forests, while underground networks tried to preserve national identity and await political shifts in the wider war. Strategically, the Baltics became vital for Germany's campaign against the Soviet Union. The ports of Liepaja, Tallinn, and Riga served as naval bases for operations in the Baltic Sea. Airfields hosted Luftwaffe units supporting the siege of Leningrad. Railways transported troops and supplies toward the northern sector of the Eastern Front. The geography of the region, dense forests, marshes, and long coastlines, presented both advantages and challenges for military operations. German forces relied heavily on local recruits and auxiliary formations to maintain control over the territory, especially as the Wehrmacht focused its main strength on the front lines. Soviet partisans attempted to disrupt German control, though activity in the Baltics was initially limited compared to Belarus or Ukraine. The rapid Soviet retreat in 1941 had left few organized resistance cells, and the population's hostility toward the USSR reduced local support. Nevertheless, as the war dragged on, partisan activity increased, supplied and coordinated by Soviet intelligence. Sabotage of railways, assassinations of collaborators, and attacks on German convoys gradually intensified, forcing the occupiers to commit more resources to internal security. By the close of 1941, the Baltic states had been transformed from independent republics into contested occupied zones. Within 2 years, their people had experienced Soviet incorporation, deportations, German invasion, and now Nazi administration. Each shift eroded hopes of self-determination. The local populations faced the ongoing dilemma of survival under alternating powers, with choices constrained by fear, coercion, and the unpredictable course of the war. For both Germany and the Soviet Union, the Baltics were not ends in themselves, but strategic corridors, toward Leningrad, toward supply routes, toward control of the Northern Front. For Latvians, Lithuanians, and Estonians, however, the reality was a struggle to endure amid forces far beyond their control. By 1942, the Baltic territories had become firmly embedded in the German war machine, yet the complex dynamics of occupation continued to evolve. The Reichskommissariat Ostland was not a uniform structure. While German civil authorities imposed strict control, military command remained influential, particularly near the front lines. This dual administration often produced conflicting priorities. Civilian administrators emphasized long-term Germanization and exploitation, while the Wehrmacht sought immediate logistical support for ongoing operations. Local populations were caught in the tension between these demands, compelled to supply food, labor, and infrastructure for the war effort. Conscription into auxiliary formations expanded significantly during this period. Baltic men were recruited, sometimes voluntarily, but often under pressure, into Schutzmannschaften, police battalions, that numbered in the tens of thousands. By mid-1943, Latvia alone had over 3,000 men serving in such units, while Lithuania and Estonia contributed similar numbers. Initially tasked with maintaining order and combating partisans, these formations were later deployed to frontline duties. They became a crucial part of the German system of control, providing manpower the Wehrmacht could no longer spare. This recruitment reflected the shrinking pool of German soldiers available after defeats at Moscow and Stalingrad, as well as the occupiers' reliance on local resources to sustain their war in the East. At the same time, German authorities initiated the creation of national Waffen-SS divisions. In 1943, the 15th and 19th Waffen-Grenadier Divisions of the SS, Latvian, the 20th Waffen-Grenadier Division of the SS, Estonian, and the 16th SS Division in Lithuania were formed, though Lithuania's project faced more resistance and difficulties. These units combined conscripts and volunteers, many of whom enlisted under promises of better rations, protection for their families, or hopes of defending their homeland against a possible Soviet return. German propaganda presented these formations as national legions, yet in practice they remained firmly under SS command. The civilian experience under German occupation was defined by scarcity and surveillance. Farmers faced rigid requisition quotas, leaving little surplus for families. Urban populations endured rationing, shortages of heating fuel, and reliance on the black market. Schools and cultural institutions functioned under German censorship, with national languages tolerated, but political expression tightly controlled. Intellectuals and professionals often navigated conflicting pressures. Cooperation with German authorities offered survival, but risked later being branded as collaboration when power shifted. Many individuals attempted to maintain neutrality, though the occupation's pervasive demands made complete avoidance nearly impossible. Resistance during these years developed in varied forms. Soviet-backed partisans, supplied by parachute drops and clandestine radio communication, intensified operations in forests and rural areas. Attacks on German convoys and sabotage of rail lines became more frequent, though reprisals against civilians were severe. Parallel to Soviet resistance, some clandestine groups sought to preserve the idea of Baltic independence, secretly preparing for a post-war scenario in which neither Germany nor the Soviet Union would dominate. These organizations were small and fragmented, but they reflected persistent aspirations for national survival. The Jewish population, already targeted from the outset of German occupation, faced systematic extermination by 1942-43. Mass shootings carried out by Einsatzgruppen and local collaborators had destroyed most Jewish communities within months of the invasion. Survivors were confined in ghettos in cities such as Riga, Kaunas, and Vilnius, later deported to camps or murdered. By the end of 1943, the Holocaust in the Baltics was nearly complete, with only a few thousand Jews surviving in hiding or through forced labor. This dimension of occupation underscored the brutality of German racial policy and its integration into broader military aims. Strategically, the Baltics functioned as a rear area for the siege of Leningrad and the northern sector of the Eastern Front. Rail lines through Daugavpils and Pskov carried supplies, while ports at Tallinn and Riga supported naval operations. As the Red Army began to recover from its initial defeats and prepared for counteroffensives, German planners increasingly recognized the vulnerability of their northern flank. Defensive fortifications were strengthened along river lines and coastlines, but the strain on German manpower meant Baltic recruits became indispensable to holding positions. By late 1943, the situation in the Baltics reflected the broader trajectory of the war. Germany was still entrenched, but momentum had shifted. The Soviet victories at Stalingrad and Kursk signaled an eventual return of Red Army forces. For Latvians, Lithuanians, and Estonians, this looming prospect was fraught with uncertainty. Many feared the reimposition of Soviet rule and another wave of repression, while others hoped it would bring liberation from German control. In villages, towns, and military camps alike, people braced for another transformation of authority, knowing that once again, their lands would become a battleground between empires. By early 1944, the balance of power in the East had shifted decisively. The Red Army's winter offensives drove German forces back across Ukraine and Belarus, and pressure mounted on the northern sector of the front. The Baltic region, once a secure rear area for the Wehrmacht, now became a frontline theater once again. Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Georg von Küchler, and later by Ferdinand Schörner, faced the task of defending a vast arc stretching from Lake Peipus in Estonia through Latvia and into Lithuania. The forces available were depleted, German divisions were under strength, and large portions of their ranks were filled with Baltic conscripts in Waffen-SS divisions, or auxiliary units. The German defensive strategy relied heavily on geography. The Narva River in northeastern Estonia, the Daugava River in Latvia, and fortified positions in Lithuania became key lines of resistance. At Narva, in February 1944, German and Estonian units fought alongside one another in battles that held the Soviet advance for months. The 20th Waffen-Grenadier Division of the SS, Estonian, formed from conscripts and volunteers, played a prominent role in these engagements, though at heavy cost. Similarly, Latvian SS divisions fought to delay the Soviet approach to Riga and the Daugava line. These defensive battles combined German command structures with Baltic manpower, highlighting the integration of local soldiers into the Wehrmacht's desperate efforts. Civilian life during this phase was marked by intensifying hardship. German authorities increased requisitioning to support the war effort, while Allied bombing raids struck transport hubs such as Riga and Tallinn. As the front drew closer, evacuations became frequent. Thousands of civilians fled westward, fearing Soviet reoccupation and recalling the deportations of 1941. German propaganda encouraged flight, while Soviet broadcasts promised amnesty to those who remained loyal. Families were divided by decisions to evacuate, stay, or hide. The uncertainty of shifting front lines created an atmosphere of anxiety and displacement across the region. Partisan warfare escalated as the Red Army approached. Soviet partisan groups, now larger and better supplied, coordinated more closely with advancing military formations. They targeted German logistics, destroyed railway bridges, and ambushed convoys, undermining rear area security. German reprisals were severe. Entire villages suspected of aiding partisans were burned, and inhabitants deported or executed. In response, German forces relied increasingly on Baltic auxiliary police units to combat partisans, placing local men in the difficult position of fighting against fellow countrymen aligned with the Soviets. The Red Army launched the Baltic Offensive in the summer of 1944 as part of a series of massive operations following Operation Bagration in Belarus. Soviet fronts under Generals Ivan Bagramian and Leonid Govorov advanced with overwhelming superiority, supported by armored corps and extensive artillery. In July 1944, Vilnius was encircled and captured after fierce fighting involving German and Lithuanian troops. By September, Soviet forces had entered Riga's outskirts, while German units retreated toward Courland and the coast. The rapidity of the advance shocked both occupiers and civilians, as territories that had been under German rule for 3 years were retaken in weeks. For many Latvians, Lithuanians, and Estonians, the Soviet return presented agonizing choices. Some soldiers deserted German units, attempting to hide or return home before Soviet forces arrived. Others continued to fight alongside German divisions, fearing Soviet reprisals or believing they were defending their homelands from another occupation. Civilians who had cooperated with German authorities faced arrest or execution. Those suspected of aiding Soviet partisans during German rule were also at risk, as German security forces carried out last-minute crackdowns before retreating. The battles of 1944 brought massive destruction to the Baltic states. Cities such as Narva were reduced to ruins, while Riga, Vilnius, and Kaunas suffered extensive damage. Infrastructure collapsed under the dual strain of combat and scorched earth tactics. Both German and Soviet forces requisitioned food and supplies, leaving civilians struggling with famine conditions. Refugees streamed westward toward the Baltic coast, hoping to reach Germany or Scandinavia, while others were trapped in encircled pockets of fighting. By the autumn of 1944, the Soviet Union had reoccupied most of the Baltics. Lithuania was fully under Soviet control by August, Latvia by October, and Estonia by November. German remnants were pushed into the Courland pocket in western Latvia, where they held out until May 1945. For the second time in 4 years, the Baltic states were absorbed into the Soviet Union. The cycle of shifting occupations, forced mobilizations, and civilian suffering entered a new stage, one that would extend beyond the end of the war. This return of Soviet power did not signal stability, but rather a new phase of repression and resistance. The years 1944-45 marked the beginning of mass arrests, deportations, and renewed partisan warfare against Soviet rule, setting the stage for the final and perhaps most enduring struggle of Baltic societies during the Second World War. The Soviet return to the Baltic states in 1944 was accompanied by swift reimposition of authority. Within weeks of recapturing Vilnius, Riga, and Tallinn, Soviet security services and party officials set about restoring political structures dismantled during German occupation. Local communist cadres, many of whom had fled east in 1941, returned with the Red Army, accompanied by NKVD detachments tasked with re-establishing control. National councils and institutions created under German supervision were dissolved, their leaders arrested or executed. Once again, the Baltic republics were formally integrated as constituent parts of the Soviet Union, with their pre-war annexation reaffirmed by Moscow. The immediate priority for Soviet authorities was security. Thousands of individuals suspected of collaboration with the Germans were detained. Former policemen, administrators, and members of the Waffen-SS divisions faced arrest, while their families were subjected to investigation. Trials, often summary in nature, led to executions or deportations. At the same time, Soviet security organs targeted nationalist underground groups that had sought independence during the German occupation. The NKVD launched counterinsurgency operations to dismantle these networks, viewing them as potential allies of Western intelligence and obstacles to Soviet consolidation. Mass mobilization followed. Conscription was reintroduced, and Baltic men of military age were drafted into the Red Army. Tens of thousands were dispatched to units fighting on the front lines in 1944-45, with many serving far from their homelands. While some individuals complied willingly, others resisted, hiding in forests or attempting to escape westward. Desertion rates were high, reflecting deep ambivalence toward Soviet authority. Nonetheless, Baltic recruits contributed to Soviet advances into East Prussia and beyond, illustrating the dual reality of forced participation and continued distrust. Civilians endured the consequences of shifting power. The devastation of 1944 left cities in ruins and rural areas stripped of resources. Reconstruction was hindered by the scale of destruction. Bridges, factories, and railways had been systematically destroyed during retreats by both German and Soviet forces. Food shortages were acute, worsened by requisitioning for the Red Army. Families already displaced by German evacuations now faced new dislocations under Soviet rule. Those who had fled west during the German retreat often found themselves permanently separated from relatives who remained, marking the beginning of a Baltic diaspora that would grow in post-war years. Resistance did not end with the Soviet reoccupation. Rather, it shifted into new forms. Armed groups, often composed of former soldiers and young men unwilling to serve in the Red Army, withdrew into forests to wage guerrilla warfare. Known later as the Forest Brothers, these fighters carried out ambushes, assassinations of local Soviet officials, and sabotage of communication lines. Their numbers grew throughout late 1944 and 1945, sustained by civilian support networks that provided food, shelter, and intelligence. For many in rural communities, aiding the partisans was both an act of defiance and a survival strategy against Soviet demands. The Soviet response was uncompromising. NKVD units, supported by Red Army troops, launched counterinsurgency sweeps to root out resistance. Villages suspected of aiding partisans faced collective punishment, with inhabitants deported to Siberia. The use of informants and infiltration gradually weakened partisan networks, but in 1944-45, these groups remained resilient, especially in Lithuania and Latvia. The conflict between the Forest Brothers and Soviet security forces foreshadowed a prolonged struggle that would continue well into the late 1940s and early 1950s. Economically, the Soviet leadership reintroduced collectivization policies. Farms were reorganized into state-controlled collectives, undoing the partial land reforms introduced under German occupation. Many peasants resisted, reluctant to surrender land and livestock. Initial enforcement was uneven due to wartime conditions, but the long-term direction was clear: integration of Baltic agriculture into the Soviet system. Industrial assets were nationalized once again, with factories repurposed for Soviet production needs. The ports of Tallinn, Riga, and Klaipėda became military assets, supporting naval operations in the Baltic Sea. Internationally, the Soviet annexation of the Baltics in 1944-45 was not recognized by Western powers. Governments in exile, particularly in London and Washington, maintained the legal stance that Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania remained occupied states. Nonetheless, geopolitical realities limited external action. With the Red Army advancing into Central Europe and Allied leaders focused on cooperation with Stalin, the Baltic question was subordinated to broader wartime priorities. For the Baltic peoples, this meant enduring another phase of foreign domination, without realistic hope of outside intervention. As the war drew to its conclusion in 1945, the Baltic region symbolized both continuity and upheaval. Continuity in the sense that Soviet power re-established the structures imposed in 1940. Upheaval in that local societies had been transformed by years of alternating occupations, mass conscriptions, deportations, and violence. The conflict had stripped away the fragile independence of the interwar republics, replacing it with a contested space where survival often demanded accommodation with whichever power controlled the land at a given moment. In the closing months of the war, thousands of Balts found themselves on opposite sides of the front lines. Some fought in Soviet units advancing toward Berlin, others remained trapped in the Courland pocket with German forces, while many civilians fled westward as refugees. This fragmentation illustrated the core tragedy of the Baltic experience. Caught between two totalitarian regimes, Latvians, Lithuanians, and Estonians were forced to fight, suffer, and survive under banners not their own, with the fate of their homelands decided far beyond their borders. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the war in Europe officially ended, but for the Baltic region, it marked only the beginning of another struggle. The Red Army's reoccupation solidified Soviet control, yet it did not erase the divisions created by years of alternating regimes. Large segments of the population remained hostile to Moscow, and a significant number of armed men refused to surrender. These groups, later collectively known as the Forest Brothers, formed the nucleus of a protracted guerrilla war, composed of former soldiers of the German-sponsored formations, deserters from the Red Army, and young villagers unwilling to submit to conscription. They built camps in remote forests and marshlands. Their activities included ambushes of Soviet patrols, sabotage of transport routes, and assassinations of local communist officials. The Soviet authorities recognized the seriousness of this resistance. NKVD and later MGB units conducted large-scale operations to root out partisan strongholds. Entire districts were placed under curfew, and suspected sympathizers were arrested en masse. Villages accused of aiding insurgents often faced deportation to Siberia, echoing the mass deportations of 1941. In 1945-46 alone, tens of thousands of civilians from Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were forcibly removed. These measures weakened partisan networks but also deepened resentment towards Soviet rule. The guerrilla movement persisted into the early 1950s, demonstrating the extent of Baltic refusal to accept incorporation. Alongside armed resistance, passive opposition, and cultural preservation became important forms of defiance. Families continued to teach national languages, history, and traditions despite Soviet educational reforms. Underground presses circulated leaflets that promoted independence or documented Soviet abuses. Churches, though monitored and restricted, provided spaces where communities could maintain continuity with their past. For many Balts, survival required a dual life: outward compliance with Soviet institutions, but private loyalty to suppressed national identities. Meanwhile, Soviet policies reshaped the economic and social landscape. Collectivization of agriculture accelerated after 1945. Independent farms were absorbed into collective farms, kolkhozes, and state farms, sovkhozes, disrupting rural life. Resistance was widespread, with peasants slaughtering livestock rather than handing them over, hiding grain, or fleeing into forests. The authorities responded with coercion, including arrests and confiscations. Industrialization campaigns began in urban centers. Factories in Riga, Kaunas, and Tallinn were repurposed to serve Soviet military and heavy industry needs, often staffed by labor brought in from other parts of the USSR. This contributed to demographic changes, as Russian-speaking populations increased significantly in Baltic cities. The question of those who had fled west during 1944-45 became another enduring issue. Tens of thousands of Latvians, Lithuanians, and Estonians escaped across the Baltic Sea to Sweden, or were evacuated by German ships to Germany. After the war, many of these refugees ended up in displaced persons camps in the British and American zones. From there, they emigrated to Canada, the United States, Australia, and elsewhere, forming diaspora communities that maintain the claim of independence. In exile, Baltic diplomats and organizations continue to represent their nations in international forums, supported by the Western policy of non-recognition of Soviet annexation. This created a unique situation. While Soviet power controlled the territory, the idea of independence survived abroad. Inside the Baltics, political life was tightly controlled. Communist parties in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania functioned as branches of the All-Union Communist Party, with leadership carefully vetted by Moscow. Local elites who had remained during German occupation were marginalized or punished. Education and media emphasized Soviet ideology, glorifying the Red Army's liberation of the region and denouncing any alternative interpretation of recent history. Public commemorations, monuments, and curricula sought to integrate Baltic identities into a broader Soviet narrative. Yet beneath this official layer, memory of independence persisted, reinforced by the underground networks and the stories of families torn apart by deportation or exile. Militarily, the Baltic region became a fortified frontier of the Soviet Union. Bases along the coasts were expanded to host the Baltic Fleet, and airfields supported Soviet aviation. The geographic position of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania was seen as vital for controlling access to the Baltic Sea and for projecting power toward Scandinavia and Central Europe. This militarization increased the burden on local populations, as resources and infrastructure were diverted toward defense needs. By the late 1940s, the combination of deportations, collectivization, industrialization, and repression had fundamentally altered Baltic societies. Resistance continued but grew increasingly costly, with thousands of partisans killed or captured each year. The Soviet government portrayed these groups as bandits and fascist remnants, while Western observers regarded them as freedom fighters against communist domination. In reality, they represented a spectrum of motivations, ranging from national independence to personal survival, united by refusal to submit. Thus, in the first years after the Second World War, the Baltic struggle did not subside, but entered a new phase. The war between great powers had ended, yet for Latvians, Lithuanians, and Estonians, the conflict persisted in a quieter but equally decisive form, a battle over memory, identity, and control of the land. The choices made during these years, resistance, compliance, or exile, would shape the trajectory of Baltic societies for decades to come, embedding the legacy of wartime experiences deep into their collective history. By the early 1950s, the Baltic states had become firmly entrenched within the Soviet system, yet the struggle between domination and resistance persisted. The armed partisan movements, though greatly diminished, still operated in forests and rural areas. In Lithuania alone, an estimated 3,000 men and women had taken part in anti-Soviet resistance during the immediate post-war years. By 1950, only a fraction remained active, but their continued presence forced the Soviet Union to commit large numbers of internal troops to counterinsurgency campaigns. In Estonia and Latvia, smaller groups survived by dispersing into isolated terrain, carrying out sporadic ambushes and sabotage. While the effectiveness of these operations declined, their symbolic value remained potent, embodying defiance against Soviet authority. The Soviet state intensified its measures to suppress opposition. Large-scale deportations in 1949, known as Operation Priboi, targeted families accused of aiding the partisans, as well as so-called kulaks resisting collectivization. Over 9,000 people from Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were deported to Siberia in a matter of days, transported in sealed cattle wagons under harsh conditions. This campaign broke much of the remaining rural support for the Forest Brothers, isolating them and accelerating the decline of the armed resistance. For those deported, survival in remote labor settlements became the new reality, while in their homelands abandoned farms were absorbed into collective agriculture. Collectivization, finally consolidated after years of resistance, transformed the rural economy. By the mid-1950s, most farms were integrated into kolkhozes and sovkhozes. Agricultural output was redirected to serve Soviet needs, with quotas enforced by state procurement agencies. Traditional patterns of village life, centered on small family farms, disappeared. The process was traumatic for many families. Yet over time, younger generations adapted to the collective system, while older farmers often retained memories of independence and loss. Urban centers underwent rapid industrialization. Riga became a hub for electronics and machinery production. Kaunas developed textile and food industries, and Tallinn specialized in shipbuilding and electrical goods. These projects were integrated into the broader Soviet economy, ensuring that Baltic production served all Union priorities. The industrial expansion was accompanied by significant migration from other Soviet republics. Russian-speaking workers and their families settled in Baltic cities, altering demographics and creating a new linguistic and cultural dynamic. In Riga, by the 1960s, Latvians no longer formed a majority, reflecting the scale of this transformation. Cultural life was both constrained and reshaped. Soviet authorities promoted education in local languages, but required instruction in Russian as well. Universities in Tartu, Riga, and Vilnius trained new cadres loyal to the Soviet system, while curricula emphasized Marxist-Leninist ideology. Publishing, cinema, and theater were censored but also subsidized, creating opportunities for Baltic artists to work within permitted boundaries. Folk traditions were encouraged as long as they were depoliticized and reframed as national in form, socialist in content. This policy allowed the preservation of songs, dances, and literature, though stripped of political independence narratives. Despite restrictions, a quiet undercurrent of national identity persisted. Families passed down stories of pre-war independence, deportations, and wartime survival. Churches, though under surveillance, remained central to communal life, particularly in Catholic Lithuania and Lutheran Estonia and Latvia. Pilgrimages, clandestine religious instruction, and preservation of sacred texts provided continuity across generations. While the state promoted atheism, faith became a form of cultural resistance. On the international stage, the Baltic issue remained unresolved. Western governments continued their policy of non-recognition, allowing Baltic diplomatic legations in Washington, London, and other capitals to operate. These institutions kept the idea of independence alive in international law, even if practical support was limited. The Baltic diaspora played a crucial role in this effort. Refugee communities organized cultural associations, published journals, and lobbied Western politicians. Their activities ensured that the Soviet claim to legitimacy was contested outside the Iron Curtain, even as it remained unchallenged on the ground. Militarily, the Baltics were fortified as part of the Soviet Union's western frontier. Bases for the Baltic Fleet in Tallinn, Liepāja, and Klaipėda were expanded, while radar installations and airfields were integrated into Soviet defense networks. The region's strategic location made it a critical component of Cold War security planning. This militarization imposed further restrictions on local populations, with certain areas closed to civilians and strict controls placed on movement near coastal zones. By the end of the Stalin era, in 1953, the Baltic struggle had entered a new phase. Armed resistance was nearly extinguished, yet the memory of defiance endured. Soviet power appeared unshakable, with political, economic, and cultural institutions firmly embedded. Still, beneath the surface, a tension remained unresolved. The persistence of national consciousness, reinforced by both the suffering of deportations and the survival of traditions. For the Soviet Union, the Baltics represented both a success in territorial consolidation and a lingering source of insecurity. For Latvians, Lithuanians, and Estonians, the war had not ended with the capitulation of Germany, but had continued as a battle over identity, loyalty, and the meaning of sovereignty under foreign rule. The death of Joseph Stalin in March 1953 and the rise of Nikita Khrushchev opened a new chapter in the Baltic story. While the core of Soviet control remained intact, a shift in methods altered the experience of daily life. The repression of the late 1940s eased somewhat. Mass deportations ceased, and some survivors of Siberian exile were allowed to return, though often barred from reclaiming their homes or property. Collectivization, already consolidated, continued to structure rural life, but the constant threat of forced removal diminished. This change reduced the intensity of fear that had dominated the countryside, even if the memory of previous years lingered. Armed resistance, once widespread, had by this time dwindled to isolated groups. By the mid-1950s, Soviet security forces had killed, captured, or compelled the surrender of nearly all active partisans. Those who remained in hiding faced dwindling support networks as rural populations adapted to new realities. The final holdouts were captured in the early 1960s, closing the chapter of the Forest Brothers. Yet their legends survived, retold in family stories, and preserved in exile communities abroad. For many Balts, they symbolized the last armed attempt to defend independence, even if militarily unsuccessful. The post-Stalin thaw also brought limited cultural liberalization. Censorship remained strict, but writers, poets, and artists were given slightly more space to explore national themes within acceptable frameworks. Literature that celebrated folklore or emphasized historical resilience could be published as long as it avoided explicit references to independence. In music and theater, national languages flourished, though political content was carefully monitored. Universities expanded, producing new generations of professionals who worked within the Soviet system, but often retained private loyalty to their national identity. Industrialization accelerated during the Khrushchev era. Factories in Riga, Vilnius, and Tallinn received investments, linking Baltic economies more deeply to the Soviet Union's technological base. Riga became a center for electronics and precision engineering, while Lithuanian industry specialized in machine tools and textiles. Estonia developed expertise in energy production and electronics. These developments raised living standards in urban areas, where wages were relatively higher, and access to consumer goods somewhat better than in much of the Soviet Union. However, industrial growth also intensified migration from other republics, further altering the demographic balance. In cities like Daugavpils, Narva, and Klaipėda, Russian-speaking workers became the majority, reshaping linguistic landscapes. Religious life, though still monitored, adapted to new conditions. Catholicism in Lithuania retained strong social influence, despite periodic crackdowns. Lutheran traditions in Latvia and Estonia persisted more quietly, providing cultural cohesion in communities where secularization advanced more rapidly. Clergy were pressured to support Soviet policies, but underground catechism and clandestine publications sustained spiritual continuity. For many families, faith functioned as a link between pre-war independence and present-day survival. On the international front, the Baltic question remained unresolved. The Western policy of non-recognition continued, reinforced by the Cold War rivalry. Baltic diplomats in exile maintained embassies and legations, keeping alive the argument that annexation was illegal. In the United Nations and in Western parliaments, occasional references to the Baltic states underscored the principle that sovereignty could not be erased by force. This international stance offered moral support to those inside the Baltics, even if it brought no practical relief from Soviet control. Meanwhile, Soviet authorities invested heavily in integrating the region into the broader ideological struggle. Propaganda celebrated the voluntary accession of the Baltic peoples to the Soviet Union, emphasizing supposed benefits of socialism, literacy, industrial development, and equality. Museums and textbooks depicted pre-war independence as an era of capitalist exploitation, while the Red Army was glorified as a liberator. Young people were encouraged to join the Komsomol, participate in Soviet rituals, and identify with the broader Soviet identity. Yet, in private life, Baltic families often passed down different stories, preserving memories of independence and repression that contradicted the official narrative. The strategic value of the region during the Cold War ensured continued militarization. The Baltic fleet operated from Tallinn and Liepaja, while Soviet radar and missile installations covered the entire Baltic coastline. Parts of Latvia and Estonia were designated as restricted military zones, limiting civilian access. This military presence reinforced the sense of the Baltics as both a frontier and a buffer against NATO, particularly given their proximity to Scandinavia and the Baltic sea routes. By the 1960s, the war years remained fresh in collective memory. Survivors of deportations, returning refugees, and veterans of both German and Soviet service lived side by side, their experiences shaping family histories. The division of loyalties during the war, some having fought for Germany, others for the Soviet Union, remained a sensitive subject, often avoided in public discussion, but lingering in private recollection. Generational divides became visible. Older Balts retained vivid memories of independence and occupation, while younger citizens, raised entirely under Soviet rule, encountered the world through school books, youth organizations, and official culture. Thus, the post-war decades entrenched Soviet control, yet did not extinguish Baltic identity. The guns of the Forest Brothers had fallen silent, but resistance endured in subtler forms, in language, in family traditions, in religion, and in the diaspora's voices abroad. The region remained firmly under Moscow's authority, but the struggle over memory and legitimacy continued, shaping the trajectory of Baltic societies as they moved deeper into the Cold War era. By the 1970s and 1980s, the Baltic states had been under Soviet rule for more than 3 decades, yet the legacy of the Second World War continued to define their political and cultural existence. The interwar republics were absent from official maps, replaced by the Estonian SSR, the Latvian SSR, and the Lithuanian SSR, yet memories of independence persisted in households and communities. For the Soviet Union, the Baltics represented a showcase of socialist modernization on Europe's western edge. Cities such as Tallinn, Riga, and Vilnius were promoted as examples of urban progress, with new housing blocks, industrial complexes, and transport systems built under centrally directed plans. Consumer goods and cultural life were often more accessible here than in many other parts of the USSR, leading some visitors to describe the Baltics as the Soviet West. However, beneath this facade, tensions simmered. Demographic changes remained a central issue. The steady influx of Russian-speaking migrants, encouraged by Soviet authorities to staff expanding industries, altered the ethnic composition of major cities. By the late 1980s, nearly half of Latvia's population and more than a third of Estonia's consisted of Russian speakers. Lithuanian demographics remained more stable, but even there, migration left visible marks. For local populations, this shift created unease about the erosion of language and cultural traditions, deepening the sense of being absorbed into a larger imperial framework. Cultural and religious identity offered outlets for quiet resistance. Folk festivals, literature, and local traditions were celebrated with renewed vigor, often framed as apolitical expressions of heritage, but understood privately as assertions of national distinctiveness. In Lithuania, the Catholic Church maintained a particularly strong role in shaping identity. Underground publications such as the Chronicle of the Catholic Church in Lithuania, first issued in 1972, documented religious repression and human rights violations, circulating secretly within the republics and smuggled abroad. Similar, though less organized, networks existed in Latvia and Estonia, where intellectuals produced samizdat literature that challenged official narratives of history. The memory of the wartime experience was central to these undercurrents. Families passed down stories of Soviet deportations, German occupation, and the armed struggle of the Forest Brothers. Official commemorations presented the Red Army as a liberator from fascism, but for many Balts, the return of 1944 signified renewed occupation. These competing memories created a dual reality: public acceptance of Soviet rituals and private remembrance of a different past. Over time, this dissonance contributed to the rise of a generation determined to recover suppressed histories. Internationally, the Baltic issue never disappeared. Exile communities in the United States, Canada, Australia, and elsewhere maintained cultural organizations, published newspapers, and lobbied politicians. The continuing non-recognition of Soviet annexation by Western governments, though largely symbolic, provided legitimacy to their claims. During the Cold War, Baltic activists abroad organized demonstrations, commemorations of Independence Days, and campaigns such as the Baltic Appeal to the United Nations in 1979, which gathered signatures from both diaspora leaders and underground dissidents. These efforts ensured that the Baltic states remained on the agenda of international human rights discussions, even if practical changes seemed distant. By the mid-1980s, the arrival of Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika opened new opportunities. In the Baltics, intellectuals, environmental groups, and cultural associations began to press for greater autonomy, initially focusing on issues such as ecological damage from Soviet industry and the preservation of language rights. These movements quickly grew into broader demands for sovereignty. Mass demonstrations, unprecedented since the war, appeared in Vilnius, Riga, and Tallinn. In 1988, Popular Front movements were established in all three republics, linking calls for reform to the memory of pre-war independence. The war years, long suppressed in official discourse, were re-evaluated in public, with deportations, occupations, and partisan resistance openly discussed for the first time in decades. The Baltic Way of August 1989, when nearly 2 million people joined hands across 600 kilometers linking Vilnius, Riga, and Tallinn, symbolized the culmination of this reawakening. Organized to mark the 50th anniversary of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, it directly connected the wartime agreements of 1939 to the loss of independence and to the contemporary struggle for sovereignty. For many participants, it was not only a protest, but also a commemoration of those who had suffered under both Soviet and German occupations. The memory of the war, once a contested narrative, became the foundation for a renewed claim to independence. When the Soviet Union began to unravel in 1990–91, the Baltic republics were at the forefront of secession. Lithuania declared independence in March 1990, followed by Estonia and Latvia in 1991. The transition was not without confrontation. Soviet forces attempted to suppress demonstrations, leading to casualties in Vilnius and Riga in January 1991. Yet international recognition soon followed, and by the end of that year, the three Baltic states regained their sovereignty, closing a half-century chapter that had begun with the secret protocols of 1939. The legacy of the Baltic struggle is thus multifaceted. It encompasses the experiences of soldiers conscripted into opposing armies, civilians caught between occupations, partisans who fought in forests long after 1945, deportees who endured exile, and refugees who built new lives abroad. It also includes the persistence of national identity under decades of repression, culminating in the peaceful revolutions of the late 20th century. In this sense, the Second World War never fully ended for the Baltic peoples until the restoration of independence. Their history illustrates how small nations, situated between great powers, endured profound upheaval, yet preserved the foundations of their statehood, ensuring that sovereignty, once lost, would ultimately be regained.